Thank you, Laura. So what we'll do is we'll hear each speaker in turn, and then we'll reserve all questions for the end. So our first speaker is Amanda Solomon, who is a senior at BYU, majoring in Middle Eastern Studies Arabic and minoring in Global Women's Studies. She is passionate about feminism in the Arab world and has experience in refugee affairs spanning the United States, Greece, Jordan, and the United Kingdom. This fall, she will be starting a gap year in China before studying for her master's degree at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So please join me in welcoming Amanda.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I know it's probably just because of the J-Dogs, but the presenters appreciate it as well. So my presentation today is titled Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Against Arab Refugee Women, Yazidi Minority in Northern Iraq. And so I actually did this for my honors thesis here at BYU. But today, because of time, I'm going to focus mostly on the case study I did of primary research dealing with the Yazidis in Iraq. So just some background on me so you know how I got interested in this. Like was said, I'm a Middle Eastern Studies major, and seeing the intersection of MESA and women's studies has been really, really interesting to me. I've been able to have a lot of experiences with refugee affairs and with the humanitarian aid community, and one thing that I read about in the literature while I studied here, but then I saw in real life, is that in humanitarian and conflict situations, the needs of women are often not addressed or even recognized. So just some basic facts and assumptions that we all need to be familiar with in order to really understand my case study. Sexual and gender-based violence is a huge issue around the world in all cultures, in all situations, but in times of conflict, it goes up universally. It doesn't matter where the conflict is, how long it lasts, or who's involved, what the instigators are. Violence against women spikes dramatically. And so when we see a humanitarian crisis like exists in the Middle East right now, there have been 6 million refugees produced from Syria, and then with all the other conflicts in Yemen and Jordan and Iraq, I think we're approaching 18 million displaced people in the region. And so we know empirically that these women are at an increased risk because not only do they have the displacement situation and the wartime situation that they're dealing with, but they have this compound experience of an increased risk of gender and of sexual and gender-based violence as well. But unfortunately, a lot of the aid workers and policymakers and other people involved in meeting the needs of these vulnerable populations, they are really focused on material needs. They are raising a lot of money, paying a lot of attention to food, water, shelter, clothing. But the trauma of women from this compounded experience, which is no less urgent, is being ignored. So for my case study, I wanted to look into an organization that's addressing this and what that looks like. So I started with the Yazidis. Can I just get a raise of hands, who has heard of the Yazidis before? Okay, a fair amount, that's good. So they're this really small ethno-religious minority in northern Iraq. They number somewhere between 700 to 1 million worldwide, but their traditional homelands are northern Iraq as well as parts of Syria and Iran. They have a unique syncretic religion that pulls in elements from Islam, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Judaism. But because of this religion, they're not considered people of the book in Islam, and so they've been subject to a lot of discrimination and persecution for centuries. So this persecution kind of came to a head for them in 2014 when ISIS entered their region of Iraq. And ISIS made it their goal to destroy this small ethnic group. And they were very heavily targeted. The main day that will live in infamy among the Yazidis forever was August 2nd of 2014 when ISIS invaded Sinjar, which is their traditional homeland, It had a population of about 80,000 pre-ISIS, and in the span of just a few days, thousands were killed, thousands fled to the mountains surrounding, and more than 5,000 women and girls were taken as slaves by these ISIS fighters, making it the largest mass kidnapping in the past century. So this, in such a small, close-knit, closed community, this kidnapping of so many women and girls affected everyone. And so in comes AMAR, International Charitable Foundation. They have worked in Iraq since a long time, and they recognize the need that not just the Yazidis have for mental health treatment, but the entire population in Iraq, because there's so much conflict and displacement. And so they set up 36 new psychological aid clinics around northern Iraq, and they trained like the GPs and the doctors that were already in the region to treat victims of ISIS, of those kind of attacks, people with trauma stemming from refugee displacement. So that's what I looked at. I looked at their programming data from this program, which was called Escaping Darkness, which aimed to help displaced people in Iraq. So my theory going into this, before I started analyzing the data, was that, okay, we know Arab refugee women experience sexual and gender-based violence at rates that are a lot higher than people know. And in the case of the Yazidis, where their targeted persecution has been even higher, we would expect to see that women within the Yazidi community are a lot more in need of these trauma treatment services than the general population. So I started by looking at the kinds of terrorist attacks that these Yazidis were subjected to. So I analyzed some data from the Global Terrorism Database, and I found that from 2014 to 2017, when ISIS was in peak power in that area, the Yazidis weren't necessarily subjected to more attacks proportionally, but when those attacks were targeted against the Yazidis, they were way more intense. You can see here the casualties were they were both roughly 18 times higher. When attacks were against the Yazidis compared to the regular Iraqi population, about 18 times more casualties resulted. And when hostages were taken, it was the same. The average was almost 330 people per attack against the Yazidis, which is astoundingly horrible. So you can see that although everyone in Iraq was suffering at this time, the Yazidis were experiencing this persecution at a level that went beyond what a lot of other groups were. So knowing this, I looked at the intake data from these clinics. I was able to analyze who they were seeing, who they were referring, who were the beneficiaries of these services. And this is a gross oversimplification of the data, but it's the most important part. Because even though Yazidis are a minority in most of the regions that these clinics were in, they were a full 92% of mental health treatment patients. And also female and male, the clinics were open to whoever needed help. They were open to IDPs, non-IDPs, men, women, and yet women were 78% of the beneficiaries of this treatment. So just looking at these really striking proportions that AMAR wasn't necessarily seeking out or targeting, but they ended up with, kind of just supports that theory that I had that because of the more direct persecution to Yazidis, and because of that compounded experience of sexual and gender-based violence against women, female Yazidis are the ones most in need of this treatment because of the trauma they've experienced. So then just to kind of establish this link a bit more, I went through some clinical notes that the doctors had kept while in this program, and I found a couple patterns that emerged pretty frequently and pretty consistently throughout all the patients that they treated. So the data I looked at encompassed 14 months from 2015 to 2016, and consistently these women and men, when they'd come into the clinics, they would say, my mental health struggles started after underage marriage, or ISIS kidnapping of myself or a family member, or displacement or domestic abuse. And so we can see that a lot of these factors that are kind of driving these mental health struggles that these people are experiencing are women-specific. Underage marriage affects women and girls at rates way higher than men and boys. ISIS kidnapping, for sex slavery, rape, human trafficking, domestic abuse, most of these disproportionately target women. And so then we can just see a couple of the main symptoms that they presented with. But also in looking over these clinical notes, I was able to find that they had really good outcomes, and that this training for local doctors who have the cultural expertise, giving them the training to treat these very vulnerable specific populations, it had really good effects. And one of the other good things about this is that even though funding for this program has stopped now, the trained medical professionals in that region, they still have that training. So there's a really good element of sustainability there as well. So just closing, my main takeaways from this were that, like, as can be seen in the literature over and over again, pretty much any case study is going to find that in conflict situations, sexual and gender-based violence against women increases. And discrimination against the Yazidis of northern Iraq, when compounded with that SGBV aspect, means that women from this community are much more likely to be in need of mental health and trauma services. But one more bright side takeaway that isn't on this slide is that these treatments worked, and that the main issue is that people don't recognize this, but here's a really good example of when people took that into account, they provided services, and they were utilized. They were able to reach the they were able to reach the population who was most in need of that treatment, and able to have really good outcomes for them. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. One of the things to keep in mind is, of course, their papers that they presented and submitted were much longer, right, than could be presented in 12 minutes. So Amanda did a great job of condensing that down into a manageable amount for us, and so we appreciate that. Our second speaker is Bryn Townley, who is a senior from Northern Virginia studying political science and also studying global women's studies as a minor. She currently works as a teaching assistant for a statistics class and a research assistant for the Women's Stats database. After graduating, she plans on working for a data research firm in Salt Lake City called Y2 Analytics, and in a few years, she hopes to pursue a master's degree in public policy. So please join me in welcoming Bryn.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Like was said, my research is entitled Exploring Predictors of Women's Political Representation in Sub-Saharan Africa. So just to give you a little rundown of how my presentation is going to go, first I will be discussing my research question, talking about important context, and then the methods I used to answer this question. Then I'll talk about my findings, some important implications, and conclude with some final thoughts. So my first research question started with my interest in the intersection between women's issues and politics. And so I'm really interested in specifically women in political leadership. And I was looking at a map, which I will show you right here, of governmental participation by women around the world. And I noticed some really interesting trends, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa. The colors indicate varying levels of women's participation in national legislatures. And so if you take a look at sub-Saharan Africa, you'll notice that some countries are in green, which means they have over 40% of their national legislatures include women. Some countries are in red, which means less than 10% of their legislatures have women. And so I was really interested in factors that would influence women being involved in national legislatures in sub-Saharan African countries. And then with that, I was also interested in the impact of having a greater presence of women in these national legislatures. So does it really matter that women are involved kind of at the national level in politics? And if so, why does that matter? Sorry, this clicker is being a little finicky. Okay, there we go. So just some background context. I'm looking specifically at descriptive representation of women. So there are a few different types of representation, and descriptive representation refers to the actual numbers. So for example, if women make up approximately 50% of the population of a country, then that means that they would make up about 50% of the government offices in that country. And also to add some more context to that, Sub-Saharan Africa went through a really interesting and important phase in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, where there were a lot of wars and a lot of internal conflict that kind of created spaces for women's movements to mobilize and have more of a voice. And in addition, many of these countries went through processes of democratization and regime changes where they moved from dictatorships to more democratic elements, although to this day there is still some questions about whether or not they're truly democratic countries. Lastly, I chose Sub-Saharan Africa as the scope of my research project because a lot of research has focused specifically on more developed or industrialized nations. For example, Norwegian countries have really high levels of women's representation, but a lot of this research has tended to ignore African countries, as well as stereotype African countries as more backward or more oppressive towards women. And so I thought it would be an interesting area of the world to focus on. So for my methodology, I employed an OLS regression, which if you're not familiar with statistics, it's a statistical method that allows us to establish causal relationships between certain factors. So my independent variables of interest were whether or not countries had quotas and the types of quotas they used, as well as if a country had a history of recent conflict, so kind of the past 40 years, if they had experienced civil war or interstate conflict. I also looked at if countries were members of regional organizations. A lot of African countries belong to regional organizations that often set goals or set incentives for countries to pass certain laws. Some of those laws can be focused on women. And I also looked at whether countries had ratified CEDAW, which stands for the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women. This is a document that was facilitated by the UN, and many countries have signed onto this document, which kind of holds them to a higher standard of implementing more pro-women and gender-equal legislation. And my dependent variable was just the percent of women in the lower house of parliament in each of these sub-Saharan countries. So my first finding is that quotas were associated with higher levels of women in government, which obviously does not surprise us because governments that reserve seats for women are probably going to have more women than other governments. However, something interesting that I found was that there are two different types of quotas that I looked at. So the first one is voluntary party quotas, which means that political parties on their own can decide that they want a percent of their candidates to be women. So this is not nationally mandated. It comes from the willingness of a political party to implement these quotas. And the second form of quota is a legislated quota, which means that in the constitution of a country, there is an actual statute that says that a percentage of seats in a national legislature must go to women. And so that's the difference between these two quotas. And I found that party quotas were actually more associated with higher levels of women in national parliaments. And my theory behind this is because if political parties are on their own willing to implement quotas, that probably means they're also doing other things to encourage women to be involved. For example, having trainings or having awareness campaigns that really encourage women to become involved, and then they're giving women the tools they need to succeed in politics. My second finding is that internal conflict was associated with higher levels of women in national parliaments. And my theory behind this was that wars and internal conflict often breaks down social norms and barriers that kind of exist in countries because there is conflict going on. And so people are a lot more focused on dealing with this conflict that is affecting their lives than kind of succumbing to social norms. And so what this does is that it creates space for women to be seen in maybe less traditional roles. So they have opportunities to assume more non-traditional roles, such as maybe even fighting in these wars or building or helping in reconstruction efforts after the war is over. And so in this process of state building and constitution building that often occurs after this conflict, women have more of a say and have more of a seat at the table, and then can push some of their demands, and the government can accept that. In addition, I found that international influence of regional bodies, as well as the UN, are less predictive of women's representation in government. And statistically, obviously, this was not as high of a predictor, but I do think that regional bodies have an effect on women in government, because what they do is they legitimize the claims of these women's groups. So for example, a women's rights groups could be putting pressure on the government to implement more pro-women policies. And if this government also receives pressure from a regional body, that means that they have two sources now that are pressuring them to implement more gender equal legislation, and not just one source. And so even though the results were not necessarily statistically significant, I do feel that more research would yield that international influences and influences of these regional bodies would be important. So next, I wanted to look at the implications. So does representation really matter? And if so, what exactly is having more women in a national legislature doing for women in that country? And the first thing I found was that there was a surge in legislation that prioritized gender equality after a lot of these countries had more women involved in their parliaments. And I think this makes sense because as there is a larger group of women, their claims and their demands are taken more seriously in Parliament, and it's harder for members of the Parliament to kind of like write them off, just because there are more of them pushing for this pro-women or pro-gender equality platform. In addition, I found a really interesting shift in the narrative. And so these issues that we often characterize as women's issues actually began to change, and they encompassed kind of a broader narrative of gender equality. And so a lot of men in these parliaments started recognizing that these weren't just necessarily women's issues of domestic violence or sexual violence. They were actually issues of gender equality. And so this narrative shifted from simply looking at these issues as women's issues to issues of actual gender equality that had implications for both men and women in countries. The third thing that I found is that despite a lot of this pro-women legislation, sub-Saharan countries actually do fall behind other countries when it comes to measures of gender equality, specifically social measures and economic measures. And so although there is greater gender equality when it comes to kind of the political equality of women in these countries, it hasn't infiltrated yet more of the cultural or social aspects of these countries. And so obviously political representation of women is one specific component in kind of a greater holistic approach to improving women's status in countries. So in conclusion, I found that party quotas and a history of conflict in countries are the biggest predictors of high levels of women's representation in government. And although these higher levels of women in parliament do lead to the passage of more pro-women, gender equality laws, there is still kind of a culture of gender inequality that remains in many of these countries. And so there is going to require more than simply bringing in women to governments in order to change these kind of gender unequal cultures of the countries. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Bryn. Another great example of condensing down a complicated argument into a digestible form. I appreciate that. All right, our final paper is a co-authored paper, so I'll be introducing both authors. First of all, we have Ashley Heinze, who was born in New Jersey. She moved around a lot in her childhood. She's pursuing psychology at BYU and actually graduates next week. Right? Along with what you're about to hear in this research, she has participated in research projects on children with autism and research on the foster care system. After graduation, she will be attending law school at the University of Utah in the fall and pursuing international work. She enjoys traveling any chance she gets and also enjoys the outdoors. The other author is Mallory Matheson, who comes from Portland, Oregon. She studies political science and international development. This past year, she worked as the Impact Evaluation Director for Girls Lobby, which is a nonprofit organization that she co-founded to teach Utah high school girls how to lobby the state legislature. When she plans on graduating in a year, in April of 2020, she plans to pursue a joint JD master's degree program to prolong her indecision surrounding her future career, she says. Many of us can relate to that, right? Which may end up being in international legal reform, rule of law, or human rights law. So please join me in welcoming Ashley and Mallory.
Okay, so I'm going to begin by outlining a hypothetical scenario that includes sexual and gender-based violence. So if you're uncomfortable with that, just be aware of that and feel free to step out if you need to. So if everyone could close their eyes briefly. So imagine that as a woman, your husband has just passed away. You're sitting in your house, accompanied with all of your children, grieving his passing, when all of a sudden his male relatives knock on the door, they're pounding on the door, and they break into your home and begin beating you. Several of them rape you, and they verbally claim their rightful ownership of the property as the surviving male relatives of your husband. They force you out of the house, and essentially you're now unjustly homeless, and you are now physically vulnerable, financially vulnerable to further abuse and hardship. So if you could open your eyes once more. So unfortunately, incidents like this have long occurred in African countries, and they're technically protected under indigenous customary law. So this practice is called property grabbing, which is the illegal eviction of women by men from their homes, and men use physical force, threat, property destruction, and other coercive means to do this. However, it violates statutory national law in many African countries, which protects women's legal right to own property upon male relatives' death. So a brief introduction to, so obviously it's concentrated in Africa. This is from Women's Stats, and it kind of shows that, the practice of inheritance rights and law of inheritance rights are significantly poor in Africa. And so we chose to study Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Uganda to highlight this. So a brief explanation of the different types of laws. Indigenous customary law include practices that are not codified in law, and they're passed down intergenerationally, very ingrained into tradition. And so they're often practiced in local communities and local courts. A statutory national law is codified. It expresses the views of the state, and you can find it in things like the Constitution, statutes, and other acts. And then international law is obviously agreements between states. They can include treaties or customs. You can have them created regionally or globally. So an example is CEDAW, as Bryn mentioned, or the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. And an important caveat is that it's not legally binding. So even if you ratify things that are trying to help women's rights, no one can really hold you to this. So basically, we found two big things. Our central finding is that gender discriminatory social norms promote the continued violation of women's inheritance rights. And many women don't press legal charges because they don't know their national rights, or they're homeless, or they're suffering abuse, and all these things. And so we were like, okay, so what should we do about this? When indigenous customary law violates human rights, how can national legal systems ensure justice for women while still respecting regional cultural sovereignty? So again, we chose Botswana, Uganda, and Zimbabwe because they have similar cultural demographics. They all have moderate discrimination codified into law, and their practice discriminates even more than law. And we also chose them because each has a majority Christian-based religious population. So it implies that even though the practice of customary law today may have stemmed from traditional beliefs pre-colonization, today it does not necessarily remain rooted in religious or spiritual beliefs.
Okay, so we first looked at Botswana, and we kind of want to go over the national law so you can kind of see the customary law and how that's conflicting with ratified national law. So Botswana, their constitution was amended in 1997, so it's been a while since they've addressed it. But they have several sections, such as Section 3, that promises equality of men and women under the law. So that's kind of where the inheritance equality comes from. But then they also have parts like Section 8, which is very, very vague if you read it. But that is how the courts deem customary law superseding national law. So like the example Mallory gave, that's kind of where that situation becomes legal under national laws because of Section 8. But they also have other statutes like the 1972 Administration of Estates Act and the 2008 Bogacy Act that try to protect the equality but also is failing at the same time. And then they party to these couple of international documents that also help dismantle all forms of discrimination against women. But like Mallory said, they're not legally binding, so it doesn't necessarily matter that they have ratified them in their country. So our Botswana case that we looked at was in 2012. This was kind of the turning point for Botswana. Mumsy and others versus Ramatelli and another. It looked at Negaketsi customary law within Botswana. That's one of the big tribes there. So 4 sisters, their father died, and they took control of their property. A little bit later, their nephew comes along, and he takes the property, exactly kind of how Mallory described. And the sisters didn't really think that was fair, so they took him to court. The first court they go to is customary court, and of course in customary court, as you probably can guess, they deemed the nephew in charge of the property and all the land. And the sisters didn't think that was fair, so they kept appealing until they got to the Botswana Higher Court, which is kind of like the Supreme Court in America. And the judge there deemed the sisters in charge of land in that Negaketsi customary law is illegal under national law, which was a huge turning point for Botswana law. And that kind of sparked the change of starting to bring in that equalization under the law. So Botswana still has a lot to improve on, but because of this case, they are slowly working towards that equality when it comes to inheritance rights.
Okay, so likewise, Zimbabwe national law, the Constitution guarantees that men and women are equal under the law, and it's very interesting. There are 2 sections that explicitly ensure women's access to land on the basis of equality of men, and it explicitly says that all customs and laws and traditional practices that infringe upon the rights of women are void to the extent of infringement. So it very clearly outlines that violations of women's rights are not protected under Indigenous customary law, although they continue to occur. And likewise, they're also party to CEDAW and the American Charter of Human People's Rights. So we looked at a landmark 1999 case, Magaya versus Magaya. So essentially, the Supreme Court ruled that customary law took precedence over the Constitution, which floored me when I first read this. But essentially, this woman inherited her father's estate upon his death. The court determined this on the basis of birth order rather than sex, but her younger half-brother successfully appealed to magistrate court because he hadn't been notified of the hearing and wanted to kind of vie for the property. And so the magistrate court determined that according to customary law, he was the rightful heir because he was a man. And so he evicted Ms. Magaya, who then appealed to the all-male panel of the judges comprising the Supreme Court. And they upheld the appellate decision 5-0 unanimously in reference to Article 23, Section 3 of the Constitution. So it essentially exempts both disputes surrounding the devolution of property upon death and African customary law from these provisions against discrimination. And so this famous statement by this judge essentially said that this case was fine because it found basis in the nature of African society, which sparked outrage among civil activists who basically said, we're modernizing, we don't promote gender discrimination, et cetera.
Okay, so lastly, Uganda. So the reason we kind of chose these 3 countries is Botswana, out of the 3, is kind of working towards, is doing the most when it comes to this. Zimbabwe is kind of in the middle, and Uganda is completely not doing anything. And it's really interesting because Uganda's constitution probably has the most specific statements out of the 3 countries that promise equalization when it comes to inheritance rights and under the law. And they have the Secession Act, and they party to these documents. So it's very interesting that they're really not doing much in that country. And one reason they're not doing anything is they don't even have any cases that have ever been brought further than customary court when it has to do with inheritance rights. So there wasn't really much evidence we can look at case-wise. And so we have these two case studies from two wives whose husbands died in 2005. So Evelyn Kalungi, her husband died in 2005, and she just started living her life on her land. Her husband's father came along and said, nope, you don't get the property, it's mine, and forced her off the land, didn't even let her live there, and she ended up homeless. And her, father-in-law took over the land and didn't even help her out. Tabisa Kira, her husband died in 2005, and it wasn't even a blood relative that took the land from her. It was actually the male clan leaders who said, under customary law, because we're part of the clan, we get power over you and we get power over the land. So they initiated property grabbing and made her homeless as well. And there's this fear among women in Uganda, and that could be one of the reasons why they're not going to the court with it, but also because under customary law it's legal. And so it's just this interesting balance of the two when it comes to Uganda, and the country's not really doing much and doesn't really seem to care to do much.
So then we said, okay, what are people doing about this and how can we make it better? And so we believe that both societal and structural change, both institutional and grassroots change, needs to happen in order for people to get on board with reforming the status of women nationwide and promoting gender equality. Because if you have legislation and people aren't on board, Indigenous customary law will still allow these practices to occur. And if you have, kind of grassroots movements going on, but legislation doesn't change, then it's like there's no, legal enforcement mechanism to make sure that these violations don't continue happening. So we looked at some non-legal and legal reformation initiatives, and we found two non-legal ones that were very effective. So first, media outreach. So in Kenya, there have been radio stations that are highlighting the stories of women who have successfully brought their inheritance cases to court. And so we think that this would be great to expand to include on television broadcasts, internet and mobile phone communications, kind of written materials, brochures that people can hand out that explain pertinent laws and outline kind of basic available legal procedures for women to take their cases to court. We can even do things like street theater to access people who are illiterate. And then second, educational campaigns and workshops have proven pretty effective to educate women about their rights. And so it would be great if more international organizations and local NGOs alike hold mobile workshops and tried specifically to involve women community leaders to participate in the workshops to facilitate trust between attendee community members and non-resident presenters, and kind of use those networks for community mobilization. Then we also proposed that we should have educational workshops only for women so they can feel safe discussing their experiences without violent repercussion for men, only for men, so we can really target kind of men's education on what they can do to promote gender equality, and then for both sexes so that they can kind of learn from each other's experience and really start to promote understanding of that.
And along with the non-legal reform, we also need legal. You kind of need both of them in order to make a good balance there. Some of the legal reformation initiatives we suggest is doing alternative dispute resolution methods. Our way of doing this is doing community tribunals. So that would basically be bringing the national courts from the big cities into the smaller communities so people have access to them. We would probably bring in some outside source to be a mediator within them to make sure discrimination isn't happening, having mandated gender training, and making sure that's an equal amount of men and women. We continue to keep doing that legislative reform, and that combined with everything could have an effect. One of the big things that we would need to do is improve the laws with legal documentation. A lot of these countries, if you have a will that specifically states that your wife can take your property, they will honor that and not follow customary law. But where they get you is that a lot of customary marriages are not documented. A lot of them can be married to 3 wives, and they just don't document if it's a customary marriage. And so just bringing marriage certificates and making sure that the legal documentation laws are there and can help promise that right for them. So overall, like Mallory said, we need that non-legal and legal means to kind of hopefully bring about some at least spark of change within these countries to prevent property grabbing, or at least improve inheritance property rights for women.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Now, I know that because we had the 3 presentations, some of you may need to leave for a class here in just a few minutes, but we'll invite all our presenters to come up and take seats up here, and then we'll invite you to ask questions. If you have them to invite you to come to the microphone and tell us who you are and then address. So if Amanda, Bryn, Ashley, Mallory, please come up and take a seat here. Okay, yeah, please.
This is for Amanda. While you were researching, what things did you find that work well in addressing worldwide violence against women, and what things don't work well?
Okay, so a huge part of my project.
Yeah, just move it. Yeah. You can even just take it out if you'd rather. Yeah.
Okay. So a huge part of my project that I didn't really get to talk about was I looked at like some of the drivers and some of the ramifications of the issue and like different methods that are being used to address it. And I found that one thing that's really helpful is trying to address the root cause of the issue, because so many, like in probably most healthcare or social issue things, it's a lot easier to address the symptoms of it than the origins. And so even like the mental health program that I did my case study on, it doesn't stop it from happening. It just helps women get over that trauma. But one thing that's being done in the Middle East that I think is so cool is they're working with men and boys. And so like they might work with like middle school boys and have like sports camps for them where they teach them like cooperation and nonviolence. Or they might work with like men in refugee camps and they'll have like discussions about like fatherhood and healthy masculinities. And that's my favorite practice because it's one of the only things that's being done right now, besides maybe like legal reform, that stops the abuse before it happens.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, this question is for Amanda, right? Amanda? Okay. What initially prompted you to work with the Yazidis in particular?
So that is a really good question, and the answer is just that I interned at Amar, and that's what they were doing. But just the fact that like I'd studied them as a Middle Eastern studies person, and I think when I saw that they had that programming data, I just jumped on it because they're they're so difficult to access as a population. There's hardly any research about them despite their persecution. So when I saw that Amar was working with them, I immediately wanted to look into it more because they're very understudied.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This question is for Mallory and Ashley. So just looking from the map that you originally showed, there were only a handful of African countries that were doing a good job with trumping communal law. So what did you, if you were, I know you did do any research in those countries or looked into them all, but what do you think was making the difference in those countries compared to most of Africa that was helping them to trump these communal traditions?
So we didn't specifically like look at each of the countries like you're talking about, but one thing we did notice in our research is one of the biggest things that those countries have is urbanization. The countries we specifically looked at and where most of the property grabbing is happening are in the less urbanized areas. And it doesn't necessarily mean urbanization is causing this, but the things that urbanization cause, which allows kind of the things we said, more access to the resources.
Yeah, for example, like courts, what are they called? Civil courts, I forget the name, but like more courts are located in urban areas, so a lot of indigenous customary courts are located in rural areas, and that's where women can't then appeal to other courts because they don't like necessarily have the transportation means to like take a full day off of work or from childcare or whatever they're doing to travel there and appeal to court. So it just gets kind of exacerbated in that sense.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you. Join me one more time, and thank you, our presenters.